If at this very moment I asked you a simple question about who is truly controlling your life, you would most likely think of your job, your circumstances, your responsibilities, or the people around you. But the truth is that if you have never learned how to master your own thinking, you have never truly lived by choice. You are simply being pulled along by a stream of repetitive thoughts you experience every day and mistakenly call who you are. This video is not for those who want to listen casually. It is for those who are exhausted from trying yet still standing still. If you have ever felt that you could live deeper, stronger, and with more clarity, but could not understand why you have not been able to, then what is holding you back may not be external at all. It may lie in your very next thought, and the moment you see that, your life begins to change direction. There is a truth very few people ever stop to face directly, that most of what is happening in your life does not come from circumstances, does not come from other people, and does not come from luck or bad luck, but from a place much closer, the way you think every day. Right now, in your mind, there are tens of thousands of thoughts passing through continuously without rest. And tomorrow will be the same. The next day will be the same. This sequence repeats for years, while you rarely stop to question who is controlling whom. I am not saying this to make you anxious, but to wake you up, because the moment you realize that thoughts are not something that simply happen to you, but something being created by you, the entire balance of power in your life begins to shift. Most people live as if they are victims of the stream of thoughts in their own heads, allowing it to run freely like a machine with no brakes, dragging emotions, actions, and life outcomes that they call fate. When thinking is chaotic, life becomes chaotic. When thinking is small, life contracts. When thinking is fearful, people stand still. And the most frightening part is that this process happens so quietly that many people believe this is simply who they are. I want you to pause here for a moment and ask yourself, today, how many of your thoughts truly serve the life you want to live? And how many thoughts are pulling you backward that you continue to accept without question? You may be hardworking, responsible, and constantly trying, yet still feel that you are not moving forward. And that is not because you lack ability, but because the thinking system operating inside you is not being guided. The deepest exhaustion of adulthood does not come from doing too much, but from living too long inside a way of thinking that no longer fits. When you believe you are not good enough, you see the world through a lens of lack. When you believe change is dangerous, you label delay as safety. And when you believe the time is not right yet, you continue waiting while life keeps moving. This moment is not for blaming yourself, but for realizing that you were never taught how to master your own thinking. And no one is responsible for that except you. This is the true beginning of a different journey. Not a journey outward, but a journey inward to reclaim control over the place that has quietly guided every decision, every reaction, and every result in your life until now. When you see this, you no longer live unconsciously, and from that moment on, all change becomes possible. There is a truth that is very difficult to accept, yet explains nearly all stagnation in the lives of many people. That most people are not truly living but are merely reacting. They wake up, do familiar things, think familiar thoughts, react with familiar emotions, and then call that repeating loop life. The danger does not lie in repetition itself, but in the fact that they are completely unaware that they are repeating. Autopilot mode is not something you consciously choose, but the brain's default state when it is not being guided. The human brain is designed to conserve energy, and the most efficient way to do that is to turn familiar thoughts, actions, and reactions into automatic processes. This is extremely useful when you are learning how to drive or brushing your teeth, but it becomes extremely dangerous when it controls how you see yourself, how you see the world, and how you make decisions for your life. Many people believe they are choosing, but in reality they are only repeating what is familiar under a different name. They believe they are thinking, but in truth they are only replaying old patterns that were installed long ago. When you are not aware, you do not question, and when you do not question, you automatically accept every thought that appears in your mind as an obvious truth. You do not ask why you constantly doubt yourself. You do not ask why you are always afraid of making mistakes. You do not ask why you keep postponing what matters. And you do not ask why you react so strongly to very small things. You simply continue living and call it personality, fate, or circumstance. Autopilot mode operates most strongly when you are tired, when you are busy, when you are consumed by daily responsibilities and pressure. That is why adults between 25 and 60 are the group most easily controlled by this mode. Because they are accustomed to carrying burdens, accustomed to maintaining stability, and have very little time to stop and observe themselves. With each passing day, they become more skilled at living without presence. Old thoughts continue to be triggered, old emotions continue to be recreated, and old results continue to repeat. And then they wonder why their lives do not change. The truth is that life never changes when the internal operating system keeps running the same program. You can change jobs, change environments, change relationships, but if your foundational thinking does not change, you will carry the same old self everywhere you go. Autopilot mode causes people to lose the ability to choose consciously, and when that ability is gone, life gradually becomes a chain of reflexes rather than a guided journey. You do not choose how you react, you do not choose which emotions appear, and you do not choose which thoughts arise, because everything has already been programmed to activate whenever the right conditions appear. The most frightening thing is that this mode creates a sense of familiarity, and familiarity is often mistaken for safety. People fear the new not because it is dangerous, but because it forces them to be awake, while the familiar allows them to remain asleep. After living long enough in autopilot mode, you begin to believe that you have no other choice, that this is who you are, that this is how life is, and that change is meant for someone else. But the truth is that no one is stuck in this mode because they lack ability, but because they lack awareness. The moment you begin to see that most of your thoughts are not chosen but merely triggered, you start to reclaim a portion of the power that was given away long ago. This is not your fault, because no one taught you how to recognize this autopilot mode, and no one taught you how to exit it. But from the moment you see it, you are no longer innocent. You stand before a clear truth that if you continue to let your brain run on old momentum, next year, 10 years from now, and 20 years from now will only be more refined repetitions of the present. And if you are brave enough to admit that, this is the moment when the real journey begins. There is a quiet but extremely dangerous belief that has taken root in most people since childhood, the belief that the voice speaking in the mind is who they truly are. Every thought that appears, every comment, every judgment, every worry, every comparison is accepted as truth without question. When a self-diminishing sentence arises in your mind, you believe it is you evaluating yourself. When fear appears, you believe it is intuition. When a negative thought about the future arises, you believe it is reality. This identification has trapped millions of people in an invisible prison for their entire lives without them ever realizing it. I want you to pause here and look directly at a very simple question that carries tremendous disruptive power if you truly contemplate it. If you are the voice in your head, then who is the one listening to that voice right now? Who is aware that thoughts are appearing? Who knows that there is a constant inner dialogue taking place? The moment you ask this question, a crack begins to open, because clearly there must be something standing behind the stream of thoughts to observe it. That presence does not judge, does not comment, does not rush. It simply notices. That is you. But very few people are ever shown this. From a young age, people are taught to think, to analyze, to evaluate. But no one teaches them how to step back from thinking itself. As a result, they become entangled in everything that appears in their mind as if it were a command. A negative thought appears, and they immediately react emotionally. An old memory arises, and they instantly relive the old feeling. An inner criticism sounds, and they believe it is the truth about who they are. In this way, they hand over control of their lives to an inner dialogue that has never been consciously directed. The voice in your head is not you. It is a product of memory, experience, old beliefs, and repetition. It speaks with the voice of the past, with the language of what once happened, with fears that once wounded you. But because it appears constantly, you grow accustomed to it, and familiarity makes you believe it is your identity. This is the deepest and most dangerous illusion, because when you believe you are that voice, you will defend it, justify it, and allow it to guide every choice you make. You are no longer free because there is no distance. Any thought that appears becomes an order. Any emotion that arises becomes truth. Any fear that is triggered becomes a reason to stop. And you call that state your true self. But the truth is that your real self does not speak endlessly. It does not need to prove, compare, or defend itself. It simply exists and observes. When you have not yet seen this distinction, you live completely identified with the mind. You think you are thinking, when in fact, thinking is thinking for you. You think you are choosing, when in fact, you are reacting. You think you are living, when in fact, you are being carried by an inner current you have never questioned. This identification is what makes people feel tired, drained, and tense, even when they are not doing anything excessive. Because living inside constant inner noise consumes enormous energy. Each thought arguing with another thought, each judgment clashing with another judgment, each worry giving birth to another worry, creates an inner environment that never rests. And when there is no peace inside, no amount of abundance outside can create a sense of wholeness. Many people search for peace by changing the external world without realizing that the source of instability lies in the fact that they have never separated themselves from the voice in their head. You do not need to eliminate that voice, because that is impossible. You only need to stop believing that it is you. The moment you begin to observe thoughts instead of being swept away by them, you create a very small but immensely powerful distance. Within that distance, you have choice. You can hear without obeying. You can notice without reacting. You can see a negative thought arise and let it pass without turning it into action or identity. This distance is the doorway to inner freedom. But because no one ever taught you this, you have lived for many years in identification without ever questioning it. You believe you are weak, when in fact, you are only believing weak thoughts. You believe you are fearful, when in fact, you are only identified with fearful images replayed from the past. You believe you are not good enough, when in fact, it is just an old program running. When you see this, you do not need to fight thoughts or replace them immediately. The first step is simply recognizing that they are thoughts, not you. This recognition can be very quiet and subtle, but its impact is foundational for every deep change that follows. Because from this moment on, you are no longer a victim of the voice in your head. You become the observer of it. And when you can observe, you can choose. This is the pivot point of the entire journey. Not controlling thoughts, but no longer being identified with them. Not silencing the mind, but standing firmly behind it. And from that position, you begin to step out of the most dangerous illusion that has kept you living as a smaller version of yourself for many years. The moment you realize that you are not the voice in your head, another door immediately opens, the ability to step back and observe. Observation is not resistance, not an attempt to change things immediately, but the clear seeing of what is happening inside you from moment to moment. This is a foundational skill, yet the most neglected one, because people are accustomed to acting rather than observing, reacting rather than being present. I am speaking directly to you when I say that true power does not lie in what you think, but in where you stand when a thought appears. When you stand inside a thought, you are swept away by it. When you stand behind a thought, you have distance, and within that distance there is choice. The choice not to react immediately. The choice not to believe immediately. the choice not to let one thought drive an entire chain of emotions and actions that follow. This separation is not something mystical or distant. It is a very subtle shift in perspective. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," you recognize that an anxious thought is appearing. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you recognize that a wave of anger is passing through. Just a small change in awareness, yet it moves you from a position of being controlled to a position of mastery. When you observe, you are no longer carried away by the content of thought. You simply see its form as it comes and goes. And when you see this temporary nature, thoughts gradually lose the power they once had. Many people believe that if they do not closely follow their thoughts, they will lose control. But the opposite is true. When you are completely identified with thought, that is when you truly lose control. Observation does not make you passive, it makes you alert. It allows you to see that most thoughts do not appear to serve you, but are merely repetitions of old memories, habits, and conditioning. When you step back to observe, you begin to see repeating patterns, the same thoughts arising in the same situations, with the same tone, the same conclusions, the same emotions. And when you see the pattern, you begin to understand that your life has been guided by scripts written long ago. This observation is the first step toward freedom, because you cannot change what you cannot see. Before, a thought appeared, and you reacted immediately. Now, a thought appears, and you see it. That small pause is where everything begins to change. Within that pause, you are no longer forced to follow old momentum. You can choose how to respond instead of reacting. Reaction is unconscious. Response is intentional. Reaction comes from the past. Response comes from the present. When you learn to respond, you begin to live more in the present, and the past gradually loses its grip. This is especially important for adults who carry many experiences, many wounds, many disappointments. Those experiences do not disappear, but when you observe them from a separate position, they no longer define you. You do not need to deny the past. You simply do not need to live inside it. Observation allows this to happen naturally, without force. You do not need to immediately think positively, because that often only creates inner conflict. You only need to see that a negative thought is appearing and allow it to pass without following it. This allowance paradoxically weakens the thought, because it is no longer fueled by identification or resistance. When you fight a thought, you give it more energy. When you observe it, you withdraw energy from it. This is a crucial principle that few people understand. Separating yourself from thought does not mean becoming cold or emotionally numb. On the contrary, you become more present with what is happening. You feel more clearly without being overwhelmed. You see more clearly without being blinded by emotion. You hear the voice in your head without allowing it to take over the entire stage. And when that voice no longer has exclusive control, you begin to hear other signals, more subtle and deeper, coming from intuition, clarity, and your true values. This is when you begin to sense the observing self that has always been there but was obscured by inner noise. This presence does not argue, does not need to prove, does not compare. It simply sees and knows. When you stand in this position, you realize that many past decisions did not come from clarity, but from the haste of thought. You do not blame yourself, because you understand that at the time you had no distance. But now you do, and this distance does not require complex practice. Only that you remember to return to the observing position whenever you are swept away. At first, you will forget many times. You will be carried away and only realize afterward. That is normal. Each moment of realization is a return. Each return strengthens the observing position. Gradually, you will notice sooner and sooner, until you can see a thought the moment it begins to arise. This is not rigid control, but gentle awareness. And it is this gentleness that allows real strength to emerge. Because true strength does not come from forcing yourself to be different, but from clearly seeing who you are in each moment. When you can separate yourself from thought, you reclaim the power of observation, and with it, the power of choice. The choice not to believe everything that appears in your mind, the choice not to let a fleeting thought determine a long-term action, the choice not to live by an old script simply because it is familiar. This is the transition from being driven to self-directed, from unconscious to intentional, and from here, the journey into the deeper mechanisms of the brain and how they can be restructured truly begins. Once you are able to stand in the position of observation and are no longer completely identified with your thoughts, a very important question begins to arise: whether everything inside you is truly fixed or not. Many people carry a hidden belief that who they are has already been fully formed, that their personality, thinking patterns, reactions, and limitations are unchangeable after a certain age. This belief is not only false, but is one of the greatest barriers that causes people to abandon the possibility of deep growth. I will speak to you directly. Your brain is not a solid block of stone molded once and for all, but a living, flexible system that is constantly changing according to how you use it every day. Modern neuroscience has proven a revolutionary truth: that the brain has the ability to continuously restructure itself throughout life. This ability is called neuroplasticity, and it completely changes how we understand ourselves and our potential. Every thought you think, every emotion you nurture, every action you repeat leaves a physical trace in the brain. These traces form neural pathways, and pathways that are used frequently become stronger, while pathways that are rarely used gradually weaken and fade. This means that your familiar thoughts are not fixed truths about who you are, but simply roads that have been traveled too many times. You were not born with a fear of failure. You learned it. You were not born doubting yourself. You absorbed it. And most importantly, what has been learned can be relearned in a different way. When you understand this, you no longer see yourself as a version locked in by the past, but as a system that can be updated. This is especially important for adults, because many people believe it is too late to change, that their brain is already fixed, but the truth is that the brain is still changing every day, whether you are aware of it or not. The only question is in which direction it is changing. If you continue thinking the same old thoughts, reacting in the same old ways, and living inside familiar patterns, you are reinforcing old pathways and allowing them to dominate more strongly. But if you begin to observe, begin to choose, begin to change how you respond, you are gradually building new pathways. And even though at first they are weak, unfamiliar, and require effort, they are the foundation of a new self. Many people fail to change not because they lack determination, but because they do not understand this mechanism. They try to change by forcing themselves to think positively, while old pathways are still dominant. When old thoughts return, they believe they have failed and retreat back to familiar ways of living. But the truth is that every time you recognize an old thought and do not follow it, you weaken that pathway, even if only slightly. Every time you choose a new response, even awkwardly, you are laying the first brick of a new road. Real change does not happen in a single explosive moment, but through small choices repeated long enough. Science does not promise instant transformation, but it gives you certainty that change is real and measurable. The brain does not distinguish between real experiences and vividly imagined ones. This means that how you think about yourself and your life has a physical impact similar to what you actually experience. When you repeatedly hold a new view of yourself, the brain begins to adapt to that image. When you focus on capacity rather than limitation, networks related to creativity and problem-solving become more active. When you continually feed fearful thoughts, networks related to defense and avoidance become dominant. This is not abstract philosophy, it is biology, and understanding this gives you a very different sense of responsibility. You no longer ask, "Why am I like this?" but instead ask, "Which pathways am I reinforcing every day?" Each time you repeat a self-diminishing statement, you are deepening an old road. Each time you pause, observe, and choose a different perspective, you are creating a new turn. No one else can do this for you, and no one can stop you if you truly understand the mechanism. What matters is that you do not need to immediately believe in a new version of yourself. You only need enough patience to walk the new road long enough. At first it will not feel natural. You will feel fake. You will doubt yourself. That does not mean you are going the wrong way. It only means the road is new. Every road that now feels natural was once new. The people you admire were not born with a different brain. They consciously or unconsciously reinforced different pathways. They focused on different thoughts, responded in different ways, and maintained different mental habits, and their brains adapted accordingly. When you understand that the brain is not fixed, you no longer imprison yourself inside old labels. You no longer say, "This is just who I am," as a life sentence. You begin to say, "I am in the process of restructuring." This perspective opens a vast space for sustainable change, because it does not demand that you become a different person immediately. It only asks that you persist in becoming a different person little by little. And it is this persistence that truly separates those who transform their lives from those who only listen and move on. When science meets awareness, you hold both understanding and tools. You are no longer confused, and you are no longer relying on vague hope. You know that every thought you nurture leaves a trace, and every small choice is shaping your inner structure. From here on, the question is no longer whether you can change, but whether you will allow your brain to be programmed by old momentum or by your conscious choice. And to answer that question, you need to go deeper into the place where old programs are installed, the subconscious layer that has been running your life behind the scenes. When you understand that the brain can change, the next thing you must look directly at is the place that has been running most of your life without you ever touching it. The subconscious layer. The subconscious is not loud, it does not argue, it does not question, yet it determines most of what you think, what you feel, what you do, and ultimately what you receive. You may believe you are making conscious choices, but in reality, many decisions are made before conscious awareness has time to intervene. The subconscious is like the foundation of a house. You do not see it every day, but it determines the entire structure above it. The programs stored there are formed very early in life, during the years when you did not yet have the ability to question. What you heard repeatedly, what you witnessed, how adults around you reacted to money, to failure, to emotions, to success, all of it was absorbed and stored as silent operating rules. You do not remember when you learned them, but you are living by them every day. If you grew up in an environment where safety was valued more than risk, you may carry a lifelong program of avoidance. If you were criticized for making mistakes, your subconscious may have learned that errors equal danger, creating perfectionism or procrastination. If you witnessed constant tension around money, your subconscious may have linked money with anxiety, making you both desire it and fear it at the same time. These programs are neither right nor wrong. They were installed to help you adapt at a certain stage of life. The problem is that they do not update themselves when circumstances change. You may now be an adult with knowledge and opportunity, yet your subconscious is still operating by old rules. And when the subconscious and conscious mind are not aligned, your life falls into contradiction. You want to move forward, yet you find yourself stopping. You set goals, yet you do not act. You understand a great deal, yet you repeat the same reactions. This is not because you are weak, but because the subconscious always prioritizes familiarity over correctness. It is programmed to keep you in what is known, because what is known once helped you survive. When a present situation triggers an old memory, the subconscious reacts instantly with familiar emotions and thoughts before you even realize it. You call it instinct or personality, but in truth, it is programming. The subconscious does not analyze, it simply runs what has been repeated enough times. This is why so many people feel as if they are being pulled backward whenever they try to change. They read books, they consume inspirational content, they understand the ideas, But when they return to daily life, everything falls back into place. Not because the knowledge is wrong, but because the knowledge has not reached the place that controls behavior. For sustainable change, you cannot work only at the level of conscious thought. You must access the deeper program layer. The first step is not replacement, but recognition. You need to begin observing your automatic reactions in familiar situations. How do you react when you receive feedback? How do you feel when an opportunity appears, excitement or anxiety? When you think about the future, does it feel open or closed? These reactions are signals of the programs that are running. They reveal hidden beliefs you may have never put into words. The subconscious speaks in sensations, not in logical language. If an idea makes you contract, there is likely a protective program being activated. If an action makes you delay even though you know it is necessary, a risk avoidance program may be operating. When you begin to see these reactions not as personal flaws but as data, you move from self-blame to self-understanding. And self-understanding is the foundation of deep change. You do not need to fight the subconscious, because resistance only creates more conflict. You need to communicate with it through patience and conscious repetition. The subconscious learns through repetition and emotion, not through reasoning. Each time you respond differently, even in a very small way, you send a new signal to the deeper layer. Each time you choose action despite fear, you demonstrate that the old program is no longer necessary. At first, the subconscious will resist because the new has not yet been proven safe. It will generate doubt, fatigue, and reasons to return to the old path. This is the stage where many people quit, believing they are doing something wrong. In reality, this is the sign that you are touching exactly the place that needs to change. If you persist and continue repeating the new response long enough, the subconscious begins to update. It does not require absolute belief, only repeated evidence that the new way does not create danger. Gradually, resistance decreases, action becomes more natural, and you begin to live differently without forcing yourself. This is when real change happens, not when you feel motivated, but when the new way becomes familiar. The key is that you do not need to change all programs at once. The subconscious updates best when guided step by step. Choose one reaction, one mental habit, one limiting belief, and work with it long enough. Each time you change one program, you release a portion of trapped energy. And when that energy is released, you feel lighter, clearer, more confident without effort. You begin to realize that many of your previous limitations were not truths, but leftovers of old programs that were never re-examined. When you see the subconscious as a system that can be updated, you stop seeing yourself as a fixed product of the past. You become the manager of your inner system. And from that position, you can begin to design how you see the world with greater intention. But to do that, you need to understand another subtle mechanism that filters your reality every day, how the brain decides what to notice and what to ignore. This is where the journey moves deeper into how your perception is being shaped without you realizing it. There is a very subtle mechanism in the brain that quietly determines the world you experience every day. And if you do not understand it, you will continue to believe that life treats you randomly, when in reality, you are seeing exactly what your inner system allows you to see. The human brain is not designed to take in all of reality, because the amount of information around you each second is overwhelming. If you had to consciously register every sound, every movement, every detail, every signal at the same time, you would be exhausted within minutes. That is why the brain developed a filtering mechanism called the reticular activating system, whose task is to select a very small portion of information to bring into conscious awareness and ignore the rest. What matters is that this system does not operate randomly. It works based on what you believe is important, what you think about most, what you attach the strongest emotions to. In other words, the brain does not show you objective reality. It shows you a version of reality that matches the belief system currently running inside you. I am speaking directly to you when I say that the world you are living in is not the only world that exists, but the world filtered through your habitual thinking. When you focus on lack, you see evidence of lack everywhere. When you focus on danger, you see risk in every opportunity. When you focus on not being good enough, you unconsciously notice every sign that confirms that belief and overlook evidence to the contrary. This is not because you are pessimistic, but because the filtering system is doing its job of protecting internal consistency. The brain prefers consistency over truth. It prioritizes information that confirms what you already believe over information that forces you to change your perspective. That is why two people can live in the same circumstances yet experience two completely different lives. One sees limitation, the other sees possibility. One sees dead ends, the other sees direction. Not because their circumstances are different, but because their filtering systems are different. This system is programmed very early and reinforced every day through selective attention. When you believe the world is dangerous, the filter scans for danger. When you believe people are untrustworthy, the filter searches for betrayal. When you believe you are unworthy, the filter magnifies every small failure and dims every success. This creates a closed loop in which belief shapes perception and perception reinforces belief. And this loop runs so quietly that you call it reality. You do not realize that you are living inside an edited version of the world. I want you to understand that this filtering system is not an enemy, it is a tool. It only becomes a problem when you let it run on old programming without intervention. When you do not choose what you focus on, the subconscious chooses for you based on old programs. And then you not only live within limitation, you also cannot see the way out. Many people say they do not see opportunities, do not see paths forward, do not see solutions. But the truth is, those things are still there. The filter simply does not allow them through. When you begin to change your foundational thinking, you do not only change your emotions, you change what you are able to notice. This is why inner change always precedes outer change. When you begin to believe that you can learn, the filter starts looking for information that supports learning. When you begin to believe that you can move forward, the filter starts noticing people, resources, and opportunities that align with progress. When you begin to believe that you have choice, the filter starts revealing paths you previously could not see. This explains why sometimes a small shift in perspective makes everything around you seem to open up, not because the world changed, but because the filter was adjusted. But you need to be careful, because this system does not respond to empty words. It responds to repeated attention and the emotion attached to it. If you say you want to change but continue to focus on fear every day, the filter will still prioritize fear. If you say you want to grow but constantly compare yourself and diminish yourself, the filter will still search for evidence of inferiority. Changing the filtering system requires you to take responsibility for where you place your attention. Every time you sink into an old stream of thought, you are instructing the brain that this matters. Every time you nurture a familiar emotion, you are reinforcing the filtering criteria. Conversely, every time you intentionally direct your attention toward a new perspective, you are teaching the filter to operate differently. At first, you will not see much result, because the old system is deeply ingrained. But if you persist in paying attention to the new, even a little each day, the system begins to update. Things you once overlooked start to appear. Opportunities you once ignored become visible. Options you never considered begin to take shape. And you are surprised not because the world changed, but because you are seeing more. This is when you understand that freedom does not come from controlling circumstances, but from mastering perception. You do not need to force yourself into artificial optimism. You only need to honestly observe what you are allowing the filter to prioritize. You can start very simply by noticing what you frequently complain about, because that is where your attention is being pulled. You can also notice what easily triggers anger or anxiety, because those are signals that the filter is being programmed around threat. When you see this, you do not need to blame yourself. You only need to understand that if you want to experience a different reality, you must provide the filter with new criteria. And new criteria do not come from wishing, they come from practice. You practice paying attention to what you want to expand. You practice recognizing opportunity instead of only seeing problems. You practice asking open questions instead of reaching closed conclusions. Each small practice like this gradually changes how your brain scans the world. When the filtering system changes, your emotions change as well, because emotions are responses to what you notice. And when emotions change, your actions change. You begin to see clearly that external reality is the result of a chain of processes that begins with thought and perception. This is a crucial connection point in the journey, because from here you not only understand that thoughts influence life, you see the exact pathway through which that influence occurs. And once you see the filtering mechanism, you are ready to move to the next step, understanding how the cycle of thought, emotion, and action is continuously creating your reality day by day without you ever stopping to observe it. Once you see how the perceptual filtering system shapes what you notice, the next step is to look directly at the continuous cycle that turns what is inside into results outside. This cycle happens so quickly that many people believe their emotions and actions are natural reactions to circumstances, when in fact they are the outcome of a process that begins with thought. Every day you are not only living in the external world, but also inside an internal stream of thinking. And that stream initiates the cycle of thought, emotion, and action, which then loops back to reinforce the original thought. This cycle does not rest, does not stop, and does not require your permission to operate. If you do not intervene, it will continue running along familiar pathways and producing familiar results. I am explaining this so you can see that nothing in your life happens in isolation. A small thought can set the tone for an entire day. A single interpretation of an event can determine your entire response. When a thought appears, it activates a corresponding emotional state. If the thought carries threat, defensive emotions arise. If the thought carries expansion, feelings of enthusiasm appear. Emotions are not enemies. They are signals showing how the nervous system is responding to your interpretation of reality. Emotions then guide action. When you feel anxious, you tend to avoid. When you feel confident, you tend to move forward. And action, or the lack of it, creates results. Those results then return to confirm the original thought. If you believe you are not good enough and avoid opportunities, you gain fewer positive experiences, which then reinforces the belief that you are not good enough. The closed loop completes itself, and you call it reality. This cycle is so powerful that it can maintain a belief for years without new evidence. It only needs repetition. The danger is that this cycle operates at a semi-unconscious level. You do not notice which thoughts you are choosing. You only feel the emotion and react to it. By the time results appear, you believe they were inevitable. But when you look at the cycle from beginning to end, you start to see many points where intervention is possible. You do not need to change the entire cycle at once. You only need to intervene early enough at one point. If you can notice a thought as it appears, you gain the opportunity to choose a different interpretation. If you can notice an emotion as it begins, you can pause impulsive action. If you can change an action, even slightly, you create a different result, and that result gradually weakens the old belief. This is why awareness is the key. Without awareness, you live inside the cycle. With awareness, you begin to stand outside it. I'm telling you that many things you once believed were your nature are simply products of this cycle. You are not lazy. You are reacting to discouragement triggered by old thinking. You do not lack discipline. You are avoiding action because of a fear-based thought. You do not lack motivation. You are living inside a cycle that does not generate enough positive emotion to propel you forward. When you understand this, you stop blaming yourself and start working with the cycle. Each time you pause between thought and action, you create a gap. That gap is where freedom appears. At first, the gap is very small. You may only notice the thought after the emotion has already appeared. That is still progress. Gradually, you will notice thoughts earlier. And the earlier you notice, the more choice you have. You can ask whether this thought is actually serving you. You can ask how you are interpreting the situation. You can choose a different action even while the old emotion is still present. This is crucial because you do not need to wait for emotions to disappear before acting. New action creates new emotion. When you act against the old cycle, you send a strong signal to the subconscious that another way is safe. Gradually, the cycle begins to change. New thoughts generate new emotions. New emotions lead to new actions. New actions produce new results, and new results begin rewriting old beliefs. This is how change happens in real life, not through a single moment of awakening, but through small, repeated interventions. Many people wait until they feel ready to act, but the truth is that readiness is usually the result of a change cycle. If you wait, you will wait forever. Change begins when you act while the old emotion is still there. You do not need to deny the emotion. You only need to stop giving it exclusive control over your actions. This requires awareness and a gentle but persistent form of discipline. Not forced discipline, but the discipline of someone who understands what they are doing. When you begin to view life through the lens of this cycle, you no longer see yourself as powerless in the face of circumstances. You clearly see the small levers that can create large change, and one of the most powerful levers is realizing that no thought is neutral. Every thought you nurture is pulling the cycle in a direction. Understanding this leads you to the next step, where you must face the truth that every thought carries a consequence, whether you are aware of it or not. Once you have seen how the cycle of thought, emotion, and action operates, an unavoidable truth begins to reveal itself. There are no harmless thoughts, and there are no thoughts that remain neutral. Every thought that appears in your mind is doing something very specific. It is either expanding your life or contracting it. You may not feel the consequence immediately, but it is still taking place. Thoughts are not like clouds drifting across the sky and disappearing without leaving a trace. Thoughts are like seeds planted in the inner soil, and that soil is always responding. When you think a limiting thought, you are sending a subtle command to the nervous system to protect, to withdraw, to avoid risk. When you think an expansive thought, you activate different networks related to exploration, learning, and forward movement. You may say that you are just thinking casually or only thinking briefly, but the brain does not distinguish the seriousness of a thought. It only registers frequency and the emotion attached to it. A negative thought repeated many times, even gently, carries more power than a positive thought that appears once and disappears. This is why many people say they think positively, but their lives do not change, because most of the remaining time they are nurturing thoughts that work in the opposite direction. There are no neutral thoughts, because every thought is reinforcing some neural pathway. Each time you allow a self-diminishing thought to exist without being recognized, you deepen an old road. Each time you sink into an anxious future scenario without stopping, you are training the brain to respond to the future as a threat. Conversely, each time you choose to view a situation as an opportunity to learn, you are creating a new path. This does not mean you must control every thought that appears, because that is impossible. But it does mean you must take responsibility for the thoughts you keep, nurture, and allow to repeat. Thoughts appear automatically, but whether you stay with them or not is a choice. And it is that choice that shapes who you become. Many people believe they have no power over their thoughts because thoughts arise too quickly. But the truth is that power lies in the moment that follows. The moment you decide whether a thought deserves your attention, the moment you decide whether to continue feeding it or to redirect, the moment you decide whether to turn it into action or let it pass. These moments occur hundreds of times each day, and you rarely notice them, yet together they form the trajectory of your life. When you understand that there are no neutral thoughts, you begin to view your inner life through a different lens. You no longer see thinking as something inconsequential, but as an action, an inner action with very real consequences. Every thought you choose to keep is a vote for the version of yourself you are becoming. If you frequently keep thoughts of doubt, you are voting for a cautious version. If you frequently keep thoughts of blame, you are voting for a defensive version. If you frequently keep expansive thoughts, you are voting for a version that dares to step forward. This is not pressure, it is clarity. When you clearly see that every thought has direction, you become more careful with your inner world, not through tension, but through awareness. You do not need to eliminate negative thoughts immediately. You only need to recognize that if you continue to feed them, they will continue to feed a corresponding reality. This recognition creates a different kind of inner maturity. You no longer blame circumstances or other people when your emotions are pulled down. You begin to ask yourself which thoughts you allowed to stay, where you placed your attention, which story you repeated in your mind. And when you begin to ask these questions, you move from the role of someone being affected to the role of someone taking responsibility. Responsibility here is not a burden, it is power. Because if your thoughts are contributing to the creation of your life, then you are no longer powerless. You can begin with very small changes. You do not need to think positively all the time. You only need to stop automatically believing every negative thought. You do not need to imagine a radiant future. You only need to stop imagining a catastrophic one. These small changes create a very slight shift in trajectory, but if maintained long enough, they lead you somewhere completely different. This is the point many people miss, because they search for dramatic breakthroughs, while real power lies in the consistency of small choices. When you understand that there are no neutral thoughts, you no longer live carelessly with your inner world. You begin to treat it as a place that needs care, guidance, and management like any other important area of life. And from this understanding, you are ready for the next step. Learning how to choose your thoughts consciously, instead of letting thoughts choose you. This is where you begin to move from awareness into practice, from understanding into mastery. Once you accept the truth that there are no neutral thoughts, the next step is no longer understanding but skill. The skill of choosing thoughts. This is not about stopping thoughts from appearing, because that is impossible, but about deciding which thoughts are allowed to stay, which thoughts are nurtured, and which thoughts are allowed to pass. I am speaking directly to you when I say that most people live in a state of being chosen by their thoughts rather than choosing their thoughts. A thought appears and immediately pulls along a chain of interpretations, emotions, and actions without any examination. When this repeats long enough, it becomes a mental habit. The art of choosing thoughts begins with clearly distinguishing between two different moments. The moment a thought arises and the moment you decide to attach yourself to it. The first moment is automatic. The second is where power lives. You cannot control a thought knocking on the door, but you have full authority to decide whether to open it. This requires a level of awareness sufficient to notice the thought as it first appears. At the beginning, you will notice late, after emotion has already carried you some distance. That is fine, because each moment of noticing, even late, is still training the muscle of observation. Gradually, you will notice earlier and earlier, until you can see a thought the moment it flashes into existence. When you notice early, you have time to choose. Choosing here does not mean forcing yourself to think differently immediately, but asking a question. Is this thought serving the life I want to live or not? Is it expanding or contracting? Is it leading me toward useful action or keeping me stuck? The question does not require a long answer, only a sense of direction. If it pulls you downward, it does not need to be fed. If it opens you up, it deserves to stay. This art does not demand that you always be right, but that you be honest. Honest about the effect a thought has on your inner state. A thought that is logically correct but leaves you paralyzed is still not a thought worth keeping. A thought that is imperfect but moves you forward is far more valuable. When you begin choosing thoughts by this criterion, you are changing how the brain learns. The brain learns through attention. Thoughts you give attention to grow stronger. Thoughts you ignore gradually weaken. This means that every time you do not follow an old thought, you weaken an old pathway. Every time you return to a new thought, even awkwardly, you lay the first brick of a new path. This art is not a single action but a repeated practice. You will fail many times. You will forget and be carried away. That does not make you weaker. It only shows that you are learning. What matters is that you return. Each return strengthens the role of the chooser. One important thing to understand is that choosing thoughts does not mean denying reality. It is not self-deception or painting everything in bright colors. It is choosing the perspective that allows you to respond most effectively to reality. When facing difficulty, you can choose the thought that you are trapped, or choose the thought that this is data for adjustment. The same circumstance, two different trajectories. The art of choosing thoughts also requires preparation. When you are tired, stressed, or emotionally triggered, it is difficult to make good choices without having options ready. That is why you need to identify situations that usually pull you into old thinking and prepare alternative thoughts in advance. Not distant affirmations, but statements that are real enough to believe and open enough to act upon. For example, when facing criticism, instead of letting automatic thought lead you into defense, you can prepare a thought that this feedback gives me data to improve. When facing procrastination, instead of sinking into self-blame, you can choose the thought that I will begin with one very small step. This preparation does not make you rigid, it makes you flexible. It creates rails so that when emotion arises, you do not derail. The art of choosing thoughts also relates to how you choose your mental inputs. What you read, hear, watch, and discuss each day is planting seeds into your thinking system. If you constantly consume content filled with fear, judgment, and pessimism, you are feeding corresponding thoughts. Conversely, if you choose sources that nourish clarity and possibility, you create conditions for expansive thoughts to arise more naturally. Choosing thoughts does not only happen in your head, it also happens in how you design your environment. When you practice this long enough, you will notice a very important shift. You no longer need much effort to choose. Thoughts you once had to struggle to hold begin to appear more easily. Old thoughts that once pulled you down appear less often and with less force. This is a sign that mental habits are changing. You are no longer fighting thoughts, you are training them. And like any skill, this one becomes more refined over time. You begin to notice very small, very subtle thoughts that carry great influence. You begin to see that a slight adjustment at the level of thought changes the entire chain that follows. When you master the art of choosing thoughts, you no longer live in a reactive state. You live in a guiding state. But to maintain this during difficult moments, you need one more layer: the ability to interrupt negative loops once they have already begun. This is where awareness must be combined with discipline in a practical and sustainable way. There are moments when, even after you understand, observe, and choose, a negative loop still activates. This does not mean you are regressing. It simply means that old programs are strong enough to self-trigger when they encounter the right signal. A negative loop usually begins very subtly: a passing thought, a slight discomfort, an old memory being stirred, and before you realize it, it has pulled you into a dense chain of thoughts, heavy emotions, and behaviors of avoidance or overreaction. I am telling you this directly so you understand that the goal is not to prevent loops from appearing, but to learn how to recognize and break them as early as possible. A loop has momentum, like a flywheel. When it has just started, a small force is enough to stop it. When it is spinning fast, it requires much more energy. Awareness is that force. The moment you recognize that you are inside a loop, you create a gap. That gap is not large, but it is enough to keep you from being completely swept away. Awareness here is not lengthy analysis, but a simple acknowledgement that a negative loop is operating. That acknowledgement alone weakens it, because the loop feeds on unconsciousness. When you see it, you remove part of its energy. After awareness comes gentle discipline. Discipline does not mean forcing yourself to think positively immediately. It means deciding not to continue feeding the loop. You may not be able to change the first thought, but you can change the second. You may not be able to stop an emotion from arising, but you can stop yourself from acting on that emotion. This is the crucial point many people miss. They believe that once emotion appears, everything is already decided. In reality, action is what seals the loop. When you act differently, even while the old emotion is still present, you send a powerful signal to the subconscious that another way is safe. One of the most effective tools for breaking a loop is intentional pausing. Pausing is not avoidance, it is creating space. When you feel yourself being pulled in, stop for a few seconds and bring attention to the body. Feel the breath. Feel the weight of the body. Feel your feet touching the ground. Bringing attention to the body pulls you out of an accelerating thought loop. The brain cannot maintain a strong, abstract loop when attention is anchored in the present moment. This is not a complex technique, but a very direct way to interrupt the circuit. After pausing, you can choose one small, constructive action. You do not need to solve the entire problem. You only need one action that shifts direction. For example, if you are stuck in self-blame, choose one small task you can complete immediately. That action creates a sense of movement, however slight, and that sense begins to dissolve the loop. Another tool is asking a redirecting question. When the loop is pulling you down, ask yourself, what is within my control right now? This question moves you from passivity to agency. Or ask, what is the smallest next step? Negative loops tend to magnify the entire situation and overwhelm you. A small step brings you back to reality. Discipline here is not rigidity, but consistency. Each time you break a loop even slightly earlier, you are training a new reflex. Over time, that reflex becomes more natural. What matters is that you do not blame yourself when the loop returns. Self-blame is simply another loop in a more subtle form. Instead, you notice and return. Returning is the most powerful action. Presence is not about never being pulled away, but about how quickly you return. As you practice this, you will notice that negative loops become less frightening. They turn into signals reminding you to return to the present, to adjust your pace, to care for your energy. You stop seeing them as enemies and begin seeing them as indicators. And when you no longer fear them, their power diminishes greatly. Breaking loops is not a battle, it is a training process. Each time you choose awareness over reaction, you are training the brain to follow a new path. That path leads to inner stability. And from that stability, you can begin building a healthier inner dialogue. Because the way you speak to yourself during difficult moments determines whether you rise or collapse. This is where the journey continues deeper into transforming the inner voice from a saboteur into a steady ally. Once you have learned how to break negative loops, the next step is not only to extinguish the old, but to build the new. Inner space cannot remain empty. If you do not consciously create a healthy inner dialogue, the old voice will return to fill the space. Inner dialogue is the running commentary inside your mind throughout the day. It evaluates, predicts, compares, pushes forward, or holds back. Many people believe this voice is objective truth, but in reality, it is simply a habit repeated long enough. When left unattended, it tends to lean toward criticism, because criticism once served a protective function against risk. The problem is that this function no longer fits a life that now requires clarity and courage more than defense. I am telling you this so you understand that the goal is not to silence the voice in your head, but to make it useful. A healthy inner dialogue is not always positive, but it is always guiding. It does not deny difficulty, but it does not exaggerate it. It does not label who you are by failure, but sees failure as data. The first step in building a new inner dialogue is identifying the current tone. When you make a mistake, what does that voice say? When you hesitate, what language does it use? When you compare yourself, where does it lead you? This identification is not for blame, but for understanding. You will notice that many of the things you say to yourself are things you would never say to another person. And if you would not accept that tone from the outside, there is no reason to accept it from the inside. The next step is adjusting the tone before adjusting the content. Tone carries emotion, and emotion determines impact. A neutral sentence spoken in a harsh tone can still make you contract. Conversely, a simple sentence spoken calmly can help you stay grounded. When you notice the inner voice becoming sharp, consciously soften it. You do not need poetic language. You only need to speak the way you would to a friend who is trying. This softness does not make you weak. It creates inner safety, and safety is a requirement for growth. Once the tone is adjusted, you can work with the content. The content of inner dialogue should shift from judgment to direction. Instead of saying, "I am terrible," shift to asking what the next step is. Instead of saying, "I am not good enough," say, "I am learning." Instead of saying, "I always fail," say, "I am gathering data." These shifts are not word games. They change the role of the inner voice from judge to coach. A coach does not deny weaknesses, but always points toward constructive action. One crucial point is that effective inner dialogue often uses questions more than statements. Open questions activate problem solving, while closed statements often trigger resistance. When you say, "I must be more confident," the mind may push back. When you ask, "What would help me feel a little more confident right now?" the mind begins to search for answers. Good questions do not need to be grand. They only need to be specific enough to move you one step forward. Alongside this, you need to build inner anchor phrases for situations that frequently trigger you. When facing criticism, you can anchor a reminder that this feedback gives me clarity. When facing procrastination, you can anchor a phrase that starting small is still starting. These anchor phrases need to be prepared before emotion arises. Once emotion is high, it is difficult to generate new content. Preparation is how you protect yourself when you are vulnerable. Another often overlooked factor is the rhythm of inner dialogue. When the mind races and the inner voice becomes rapid, you are easily swept away. Slowing the pace of inner speech is a powerful way to regain control. Speak slower inside, think slower, and the body begins to settle as well. You do not need to say much. You only need to speak at the right moment. When you practice this long enough, you will notice a very subtle change. The inner voice is no longer the primary source of tension. It becomes a tool for reminder, adjustment, and support. You begin to feel that you are no longer alone in difficult moments, because inside there is a voice that stands with you, not blind reassurance, but steady companionship to keep moving forward. This creates a very different kind of resilience. Resilience does not come from never feeling tired, but from not tearing yourself down when you are tired. When inner dialogue becomes healthy, you not only improve your mental state, but also change how you act in the world. You dare more because you know that if you fail, you will not be crushed by your own voice. You persist longer because you are not worn down by self-blame. And from this foundation, you are ready to move into a deeper layer, building mental immunity against external negativity so you can maintain inner stability in a world full of noise. When your inner dialogue becomes healthier, you begin to recognize another truth. Not every shift in your state comes from within. Many fluctuations come from the environment, from people, from information, and from the pace of life around you. If you do not build mental immunity, you may be doing well internally, yet still be easily pulled off center by external influences. Mental immunity does not mean withdrawing from the world or becoming cold and emotionally numb. It is the ability to maintain your inner center while remaining fully present with life. I am telling you this directly because many people believe they are becoming weaker, when in reality they are simply allowing too many things to enter their mental space without a filter. Just as the body needs an immune system to avoid illness, the mind needs protective mechanisms to avoid constant disturbance. Every conversation, every news feed, every criticism, every emotion from others carries energy. And if you are not aware, you will unconsciously carry that energy as if it were your own. Mental immunity begins with the awareness that not everything you feel belongs to you. Some emotions are merely reactions to the environment, and you have the right not to identify with them. When you enter a tense space, if you do not have a center, you will merge with it. When you are around people who constantly complain, if you lack boundaries, you will carry their heaviness with you. Mental boundaries are not about pushing others away, but about knowing where you stand within the experience. You can listen without absorbing. You can empathize without carrying the weight. This is a skill that must be trained, because the human brain naturally synchronizes emotions with the environment to feel safe. In the modern world, however, this tendency easily leads to exhaustion. A crucial part of mental immunity is choosing your inputs. What you expose yourself to each day is shaping your baseline state. If you constantly consume information filled with fear, anger, and judgment, your nervous system remains in prolonged defense mode. This state weakens clear thinking and makes you react more intensely to minor triggers. You do not need to cut off all information sources, but you do need to filter. Filtering is not about avoiding reality, but about protecting your ability to respond with clarity. When you consciously reduce sources of noise, you create space for clarity. Another element is how you process criticism and negativity directed toward you. Not every criticism is wrong, but not every comment needs to be taken deep inside. Mental immunity allows you to receive information as data rather than judgment. You can ask what is useful in this and what does not belong to you. You keep what is useful and let the rest pass through. This does not make you arrogant, it makes you grounded. You no longer react with defense or collapse, but with discernment. Mental immunity is also related to how you manage your energy. When you are tired, hungry, sleep-deprived, or emotionally overloaded, your immunity drops. You become more easily triggered and more easily pulled into reaction. That is why caring for the body is inseparable from caring for the mind. Rest, movement, deep breathing, and moments of stillness are not luxuries, they are foundations. When the body is regulated, the mind can remain steady more easily. Another important tool is the ability to return to center after being pulled off. No one stays balanced all the time. Immunity does not mean never being affected. It means recovering quickly. When you notice yourself being pulled into negativity, you need rituals for returning. This could be a few slow breaths, a short walk, or writing down what is happening. Rituals do not need to be complex, only effective enough to remind you that you have choice. Over time, you build a recovery reflex. Instead of drifting, you return. This creates a deep sense of inner safety. You know that no matter what happens, you can find your center again. Mental immunity also involves choosing relationships that nourish you. You do not need to eliminate every difficult relationship, but you do need spaces where you can be yourself, speak honestly, and breathe. These spaces recharge energy and reinforce identity. When you are nourished from within, you depend less on external validation. And when dependence decreases, vulnerability to harm decreases as well. All of this is not meant to create a hard shell, but a strong core. When the core is strong, you can remain soft on the outside without breaking. You can stay open without losing yourself. You can face negativity without being swept away. This is a level of mental maturity many people seek, but few build systematically. When you have mental immunity, you no longer feel passive in the face of the world. You engage with life consciously and selectively. And from this foundation, you are ready to move into the next layer, training deep focus and building mental habits that help you sustain this mastery over the long term, not only when things are easy, but also when pressure increases. Once you have built mental immunity, the next factor that determines the long-term quality of your life is no longer avoiding negativity, but where you place your focus each day. Focus is not just the ability to work effectively. It is the core capacity for guiding your inner life. Where you place your focus, your energy flows, and where energy flows, your life takes shape. I am speaking directly to you when I say that in a world full of noise, the person who can sustain deep focus holds an extraordinary advantage, not only in work, but in living. When you do not master your focus, you are pulled by external stimuli and internal thoughts. You react more than you choose. You stay busy but do not move far. Deep focus is the ability to remain fully present with one task, one thought, one sensation for a long enough period to create transformation. This is not an inborn talent, but a trainable skill. And that training begins with understanding that distraction is not the enemy. It is a signal that your nervous system has become accustomed to constantly jumping between stimuli. Each time you shift attention, you are training the brain to prefer novelty over depth. This weakens patience and makes it difficult to stay with what truly matters. To train deep focus, you need to create periods without interruption. They do not need to be long. They only need to be consistent. During that time, you choose one meaningful activity and stay with it. When distraction appears, you do not blame yourself. You gently return. Each return is a repetition of the focus muscle. Over time, the length of time you can stay increases, and with it, your sense of mastery. Another essential element is identifying what truly deserves your deep focus. Not everything requires depth. Only those things that have a significant impact on the direction of your life. When you give deep focus to these areas, you are directly investing in your future. In contrast, when most of your attention goes to trivial matters, you drain energy without creating movement. The mental habits of those who master their lives are not about doing more, but about selecting better. Selecting thoughts, selecting actions, selecting goals. Those who lead themselves do not chase every stimulus. They know what deserves priority. One powerful habit is beginning the day with mental intention. Instead of letting the world flood in immediately, you take a few minutes to orient yourself. This orientation does not need to be long. It only needs to remind you where you are going and why. When you orient your day, you reduce the likelihood of being pulled into what does not matter. Another habit is ending the day with reflection, not to judge yourself, but to learn. Ask what helped you move forward today, what pulled you off course. This reflection refines your inner system. It turns experience into wisdom. Deep focus is also related to your willingness to be alone with your own thoughts. Many people fear stillness, because in stillness the inner voice becomes louder. But it is precisely in stillness that you gain the chance to observe and guide. When you fill every moment with stimulation, you deny yourself the opportunity to rebalance. Those who master themselves know how to create stillness as part of their rhythm of life. This stillness is not avoidance, but restoration. When you regularly return to yourself, you maintain clarity even when the outer world becomes complex. Another mental habit is learning to do one thing at a time. This sounds simple, yet in practice, very few people do it. Multitasking creates the feeling of busyness but weakens the quality of presence. When you do one thing with full attention, you not only perform better, you also train the brain to stay. This ability to stay carries into other areas of life. You listen more deeply, you feel more fully, you respond more slowly and more accurately. This is the foundation of inner maturity. All of these habits are not meant to create perfection, but stability. When you have stability, you are not easily pulled by momentary fluctuations. You maintain direction even amid noise, and when you maintain direction, you begin to live as someone who leads themselves rather than someone who is driven by circumstance. From here, the journey moves toward its final part, where all understanding, practice, and change are unified into a new commitment to living, not an emotional promise, but a conscious choice repeated each day. By this point, you have come very far, not in distance, but in awareness. You have clearly seen how thinking operates, how the subconscious programs behavior, how attention shapes reality, and how small inner choices quietly guide an entire life. The final part of this journey is not meant to give you more knowledge, but to place you before a very clear commitment. That commitment is not to me, not to anyone else, but to yourself. The commitment to become the architect of your thinking instead of continuing to live as someone who is led. No one can make this commitment for you, and no one can hold it on your behalf. But when you understand deeply enough, this commitment no longer feels like a burden. It feels like liberation. Because if your life is shaped by the thoughts you nurture, then you are no longer passive. You have the right to begin again at any moment. You do not need to wait for circumstances. You do not need permission from anyone. The starting point is not a dramatic decision. It is the next thought you choose to keep. Right now, as you are hearing these words, the next thought will appear. You can let it follow old momentum, or you can notice it and choose. That choice is very small, but it carries the entire philosophy of a self-led life. Mastery does not mean controlling everything. It means not handing over your inner authority to old programs you have already outgrown. Mastery does not mean never doubting. It means not letting doubt become the guide. Mastery does not mean always being strong. It means knowing how to return when you drift. This commitment does not ask you to be perfect. It only asks you to be aware enough to notice when you are giving control back to inertia. And each time you notice, you return. You return to observation. You return to choice. You return to the values you want to live by. There will be days when you do very well. There will be days when you forget and get pulled away. That does not make you a failure. The only thing that truly brings you back to the old place is when you stop returning. Each time you return, even late, you are strengthening the identity of someone who does not abandon themselves. And that is the deepest foundation of strength. You do not need to change everything at once. You only need to stay loyal to the process. Loyal to observing, loyal to choosing, loyal to no longer living unconsciously. When you live this way, you begin to notice that many things that once frightened you gradually lose their power, not because they disappear, but because you no longer identify with them. You stand in a different position, the position of one who sees clearly. From that position, you do not need to fight life. You move with it consciously. Life will not become easier in the way you once imagined, but it will become clearer. And that clarity allows you to go much farther. This journey does not end here. It simply closes an old chapter in which you lived on autopilot. The new chapter begins with the very next thought, and this time, you do not step into it unconsciously. You step into it with presence, with choice, with the commitment to be the architect of your own mind and your own life. You have reached the end of this journey, and if you are still here, that means a very deep part of you is ready to live differently. What you have just heard was not a story meant to create temporary emotion. It was a map that helps you clearly see how thinking is running your life from the subconscious to action, from attention to choice, from unconscious loops to the ability to master your inner world. You have seen that no thought is harmless, that every thought is leading you in a direction, and that real power does not lie in controlling the external world, but in choosing which thoughts are allowed to stay. When you learn how to observe, choose, and guide your thoughts, you do not just change how you feel, you change the entire trajectory of your life. Thank you for giving your time and attention to fully walk this journey. If this content gave you a new perspective or helped you see yourself more clearly, please press like to support the channel. Share this video with those you believe need to hear it, and do not forget to subscribe so you can continue walking alongside deep stories about mindset, inner strength, and the journey of mastering your life in the videos ahead.